Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and many Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, I welcome you to this, the second in the Center for Free Expression's Fall Virtual Forum series. The title for today's panel is Smart Cities in Canada, Digital Dreams, Corporate Designs. This is a special event as it is both a panel discussion and the launch of a new book edited by two of our panelists, Marianna Valverde and Alex Flynn. You will see on your screen, if you're interested in ordering their book, you can get a special discount. If you look in the middle, there's a provision for ordering the book directly from the publisher, Lorimer, at lorimer.ca/adults. And if you use the code SALE220, you'll get 20% off the book. We'll be talking more about the book as we go on in this panel. Now, while so-called smart cities projects are occurring across Canada and around the world, considerable public attention was created in recent years when Waterfront Toronto, which is a joint project of the federal government, the Ontario government, and the City of Toronto, which is responsible for overseeing the development of 2,000 acres on the Toronto waterfront, awarded a contract to Google affiliate Sidewalk Labs to prepare a plan for the development of Toronto's eastern waterfront. We're going to look back at what happened there, what other projects under the label of smart cities are happening across Canada, and what issues arise in these projects that are of particular concern or should be of particular concern to all residents of Canada. We have quite a remarkable panel to discuss these with us today. I'd like to introduce each of them. First is Alexandra Flynn. Alex is an assistant professor at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Her work focuses on the pluralistic nature of local governance bodies and their interplay in decision-making. She is now engaged in a SSHRC-funded research project focusing on Indigenous municipal planning relationships. Alex grew up in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and has had more than 10 years of experience practicing Aboriginal law and working in a senior municipal government role, including the representation of First Nations governments in the economic development of reserve lands, the drafting of land management agreements, and consultation and accommodation involving numerous governmental and corporate parties. Welcome, Alex. Our second panelist is Blaine Haggart. Blayne is an associate professor of political science at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, and is a senior research fellow at the Katie Homburger Kolleg Center for Global Governance Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany. His current research focuses on the political economy of knowledge governance. His most recent book is entitled Copy Fight, The Global Politics of Digital Copyright Reform. And he's co-editor of Information Technology and Control in a Changing World, Understanding Power Structures in the 21st Century. Welcome, Blayne. Our third panelist is Jennifer Raso. She is an assistant professor at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Law, investigating the relationship amongst human discretion, data-driven technologies, and administrative law. She is particularly intrigued by how humans and data-driven technologies produce institutional decisions and the consequences of the hybrid arrangement for procedural fairness and substantive justice. In her doctoral research, for example, she examined how municipal caseworkers located and used discretion to deliver the notoriously rule-bound Ontario Works program. Before pursuing graduate studies, Jennifer litigated social welfare Administrative and Human Rights Matters with the City of Toronto's Legal Services Department. And our fourth panelist is Marianna Valverde. Mariana is professor in the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies at the University of Toronto and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Mariana is an internationally recognized expert in urban law and governance. Her most recent research project was on the governance of public-private infrastructure partnerships, mostly in Ontario. Well, I'd like to formally welcome all of the panelists. The way we're going to proceed today is that we're going to have a conversation amongst the panelists for about 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to bring you, the audience, into that conversation. Now, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a small Q&A button right in the center of your screen. And we'd like any of you who are listening to this, if you have questions at any point, to write down your question. Just click on the Q&A and write down your question. And then about 45 or 50 minutes in, I'll bring the audience into the discussion and we'll put your questions to the panelists for discussion. So why don't we begin? I'd like to begin with Blayne. Could you tell us what the term smart cities actually means?
Sure, let's start with that. First, I'll say thank you very much for having me and for setting up this panel, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to join us. Yeah, so the thing about a smart city and what it is, I mean, the first thing to really understand about it is that there's no one consistent meaning for the term smart city. It means different things to different people, and that's kind of by design, because at the end of the day, it's more of a marketing gimmick than anything. And like any marketing gimmick, it's selling a few things. So it's selling the idea of a certain type of development, one that tends to be based on digital and network technologies and data-driven processes, and that the idea that this should be our preferred type of urban development, or this is the way that we should develop our cities to make them good and fine for everyone. Now, these things, like any kinds of development ideas, be it at the city level or at the level of a country, development ideas come in faddish waves, and this is kind of the latest shiny idea in that tradition. And it's something that cities want to get on board with. You don't want to be a dumb city or anything like that, do you? So in a very real way, the smart city is designed to sell us the future. You can think of it as a floating signifier in much the same way that modern, when we talk about modernization of an economy, is. The other thing is it's selling us the idea that digital companies and tech companies are the ones that can deliver the smart city. For instance, IBM registered the trademark Smarter Cities in 2011, and they didn't just do that for fun. Part of the goal was to say, smart cities are the wave of the future. This is what development looks like, and we're the ones who can deliver it. So it's designed not just to sell goods also, but the hardware of a connected city, but also the services and the standards that it hopes will become the nervous system of the city in the future. And that can be a concern, because if you can set the standards, you can shape the future development and path of the city and become indispensable to running them. But as for what a smart city is, it's almost whatever you want it to be. Like my chapter in the book focuses on Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Lab's failed Quayside project. And it goes into how this was largely kind of a PR exercise in which questions of substance were second or third order considerations designed more to sell the dream of a smart city, while being very extremely reluctant to talk about what that would entail in terms of governance or surveillance or the treatment of data and intellectual property rights.
Well, actually, I'm going to come back in a few minutes,
Yeah.
Blayne, and ask you to tell us more about the Sidewalk Toronto the Sidewalk Labs project. So just finish off what you were saying about smart cities.
That was literally the end of what I was going to say.
Okay, perfect. Jen, I mean, it's not only Toronto in Canada that has been dealing with smart cities issues. When you go to the City of Edmonton website, which I'm sure you've done, I'm not sure many of our listeners have done, you'll find the claim, quote, Edmonton is a smart city, a leader in using innovation to improve municipal services, from public safety to public works to transit. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in Edmonton under this smart cities label and what it means?
Sure, thanks, Jim. I'm happy to share the view from Edmonton, which may be new to most of the participants in this workshop. So, of course, Edmonton claimed itself to be a smart city and added smart city to its long list of other kind of city mottos that it has taken on over the years. And it did so in the early 2000s, so well ahead of other cities or corporations taking over this term, which might be surprising to those of you who are not from Alberta or haven't spent any time in Edmonton. You might know Edmonton as the city of champions. Or as Deadmonton, perhaps. But yes, Edmonton is a smart city. And the thing about, I think, the smart city initiatives in Edmonton that are quite unique include Edmonton's commitment to open data. So the mayor, Don Iveson, who just announced yesterday he's no longer running for re-election, unfortunately, but he was a really strong proponent of open data and not just open data that the city would be generating and using to develop its plans for the city of Edmonton, but also that data should be provided to residents of the city of Edmonton who could use that data to develop their own initiatives. And we've seen a proliferation of a variety of useful and also kind of perhaps niche apps and websites and so on in the city of Edmonton that the local tech community has created, drawing on this open data portal. So certainly open data is key to Edmonton's vision of what it means to be a smart city. But then if we look at kind of smartness or intelligence, we can see in Edmonton a number of other types of initiatives that kind of coalesce together to create Edmonton's version of a smart city. And so those would include the Vision Zero project, which Edmonton was the first Canadian municipality to sign on to in 2015. So getting in there before Toronto or Montreal. And in addition to its Vision Zero initiative, so its efforts to curb traffic fatalities. Edmonton police have also engaged in a number of other types of smart policing initiatives, some of which are those kind of complicated risk prediction systems, but others of which are really basic smart policing. We might think of as smart policing 1.0, which include photo radar. So in my chapter in the book, I examine how these three things, open data, the Vision Zero program, and then 1.0 policing technologies are used in the city of Edmonton to achieve public benefits in terms of the reduction of traffic fatalities, but then also how Edmonton's unique startup culture has created pushback against the use of photo radar. We have here quite a strong computing science program, and in true Edmonton fashion, one of the undergraduates of that program took the open data portal after he received a photo radar ticket himself and created an app for all Edmontonians to use, which helps them evade the photo radar setup in the city. So the data he draws on shows using maps where photo radar installations exist each week in the city of Edmonton. And his app draws that data in and then allows drivers through the use of geolocations on their phones to receive sound-based alerts when they're driving so that they know if photo radar is coming up on the road that they're traveling on, and then they can slow down if they would like to avoid pretty hefty tickets. So that's, you know, it's a funny story. It's very much an Edmonton type of story, but it also raises, I think, interesting and complicated questions about, you know, who's smart in the smart city, how successful are smart city technologies, if we think of not just policing technologies, but also kind of resistance technologies in terms of how effective are they at achieving kind of overall smartness in the smart city. And at present, it's unclear whether this app has had an effect on the successfulness of photo radar in the city. Certainly, there's some evidence to suggest that photo radar tickets have gone down slightly. The city relies on photo radar revenues to fund its Vision Zero program, so that's not great. But you know, if people are driving the speed limit, perhaps that's an overall good objective, or it's evidence that the objective rather has been achieved. But at the same time, you know, how easy is it for an everyday citizen to resist more nefarious types of smart policing programs, such as those risk prediction types of programs that the Edmonton Police Service is rolling out? That's unclear. So this is a funny story that I unpack in my chapter, but one that raises a lot of questions about smartness, and perhaps the frustration of municipal public policy goals through the use of smart technologies.
I guess it's an example of innovation that universities don't think of when they talk about innovation.
Exactly. And by the way, the developer of the app, he wasn't charging for the app, but he said he would gladly accept donations to offset the cost of his university tuition. So
good. Well, I hope he gets some income from that. Mariana, smart city projects, I think, almost always are partnerships between the public and private sector. What typically is the role of the public sector in this? Is it a junior partner? Is it a full partner? Is there a pattern that you've seen in your work?
I don't think there's a pattern at all. In the EU, it's more the EU as a whole rather than individual countries. There are some strict, well, I don't know how strict they are, but at least there's some parameters on what you can do with smart cities. And there's a lot of emphasis on citizen participation and also on social inclusion. So the EU has a definition of smart cities that says they have to be democratically led and multi-stakeholder. So the EU's definition of smart city would exclude the Quayside project that Blayne was talking about, the partnership between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Lab, because it was neither democratic nor multi-stakeholder. Anyway, but even in the EU, they talk about public-private partnerships as the only way in which you can get smart city projects done. And I think there's such a confusion about the term partnership, because in some cases, what they're really talking about is just an ordinary contract. I mean, you know, municipalities have been contracting with road paving companies since ever. Well, since there were paved roads in Ontario. And so sometimes people will talk about a partnership when they just mean a contract for services. And it's extremely difficult to know what the language of partnership conceals. So the city of Edmonton, where Jen is, has a partnership with IBM. But what does that mean? Does that mean they use IBM equipment to have virtual city council meetings? Who knows? And so the problem with the term partnership is that it can, you know, it hides a multitude of sins. It can also, you know, cover a whole lot of things that aren't sins, that are perfectly okay, but it's misleading to the public to just call it a partnership, because a partnership suggests people are sitting down and they have a shared vision and they keep talking about things. And yet in most cases, it's just either one contract or a bunch of contracts. And certainly in the case of Waterfront Toronto had an agreement with Sidewalk Labs, but it became clear as time went on that the province and the city, at least, were very unhappy with this. And the province and the city and the federal government are supposed to be in a partnership in Waterfront Toronto, so that it wasn't clear who was representing the public interest. And so I think that one of the things that can come out of discussions about smart cities is that people stop being mystified by the term partnership, which God knows universities love to use at every moment. Oh, we have a partnership with such and such. And, you know, people then don't stop and ask, well, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean you have a contract for services? Does that mean you actually sit down at the table and negotiate as time goes on? And certainly the public interest has to be firmly upheld by the public partner, whoever that is. Usually it's an actual city. Much more rarely, as in the case of Waterfront Toronto, it's an agency that is not democratic and is run by an appointed board. But in that case, then the three governments should have been exercising oversight. And so, you know, if you're going to have any kind of contracting, tendering, and if you're going to let the private sector market stuff to you, as Blayne was saying, a lot of times what happens is that IBM will go to a city and say, hey, we have this fancy new system. Wouldn't you like to buy it? And then the chief IT person for the city says, oh, that looks so cool, blah, blah. And, you know, they buy it, whether they actually need it or not. Maybe they should be spending their money on more buses. So I think the whole smart cities discussion should really lead to questioning the rhetoric of partnership, but also to thinking about how do we plan infrastructure? Do we really need more smart streetlights, or do we perhaps need much more basic stuff like more buses on Jane Street?
And I think a little later we're going to go into how we structure things so that the public can help drive that process rather than simply being a recipient of whatever the tech company wants to put on offer at a price.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, smart city projects take for granted a robust technical infrastructure, which often doesn't exist in smaller communities, especially in the north. Your article in Mariana's book is titled Indigenous Exclusion and Access to the Internet, the Case of Nunavut. Could you tell us about the challenges that Nunavut, as a northern community, faces, and what challenges are faced by Canadians living in communities outside major urban centers when it comes to these kinds of projects?
Yeah, definitely. It's a real delight to be here all the way from Vancouver, where the picture in the background is showing the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, where I live and work, very far from Nunavut, where this chapter is based. But, you know, in the picture that you're looking at, you can see examples of infrastructure. You can see, you know, bridges, you can see roads, less obvious, but equally there are sewer systems, underground infrastructure that makes an urban area tick. And, you know, infrastructure is critical for all communities, whether they're big cities or small communities, or like in Nunavut, 25, you know, very small communities, ranging from the size of about a few hundred people all the way to 8,000 people. So in this chapter in our book, I talk about digital inclusion as a form of hard infrastructure, as Blayne put it, the nervous system of a community, and outlining how digital inclusion is necessary for people to experience the many benefits that technology can offer, including internet technology. And we may not think about how much technology and technological infrastructure affects our day-to-day lives and the lives of the people we care about, whether it's health or education, cultural expression, or the ability to participate politically. But all of these things increasingly require some form of digital inclusion, such that the United Nations and many other communities have called for the recognition of the right to this kind of infrastructure as a right. And moreover, many countries in the world, including northern countries, have recognized this right and extended it, and extended it in a good way, in a way that's really meaningful to people, which is really about broadband speed, to all of their residents in a way that has not happened in Nunavut. And so my chapter in the book talks a lot about the effect that poor infrastructure can have on people who are living in smaller communities, and how meaningful it is in Canada to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so what I focus on is linking this form of infrastructure to treaty rights, arguing that it's not just a matter of good governance to ensure that people have access to broadband, have access to this absolutely necessary form of infrastructure, but that it's a deeper set of rights and set of obligations that the Canadian government has. And this is especially meaningful in places like Nunavut that have rates of connectivity that fall far below what you and I are experiencing just by virtue of being able to participate on this Zoom call. So in Nunavut, for example, in a 2016 study, found that only 27% of households in Nunavut had access to download speeds that could really enable them to participate in required activities. So I make 3 points in the chapter. First, I argue that adequate broadband is necessary under Canada's treaty commitments to the Inuit of Nunavut. Second, I argue that digital inclusion is not an innate geographic condition. So all communities in Canada, as evidenced from countries across the world, including countries serving Arctic populations, can have basic digital infrastructure as a right. And third, I argue that we can't look at smart cities in isolation, that they're just about big communities, that they're just about one geographic area. I argue that we need to look at smart cities in their broadest sense. So in the case of Nunavut, this is not just about Iqaluit, the largest city of 8,000 people in Nunavut. It's about all 25 communities being able to participate meaningfully.
Alex, what's being done in Canada to try to deal with this issue of the inequitable access to this infrastructure? Is there any hope on the horizon? Are there any initiatives going forward? Do you have any sense of how seriously this is being taken?
So there have been many different funding envelopes that have been extended to Nunavut. You know, my chapter focuses on Nunavut, so that's the jurisdiction that I can speak most capably about. So it's not that no money has been allocated for improving this infrastructure in that area. It's just that it isn't being overseen in a meaningful way. So there are multiple, like we see with Indigenous rights, generally speaking, there are many different departments that are tasked with overseeing how this money is spent and who it's going to, without really addressing satellite and having fiber networks that extend to the whole geographic area. So right now, what we see is different pots of money that are put for particular identified needs, but not the whole problem being identified as an issue that we can address. It's not that it's exactly the same, but I think we can analogize it to the water crisis that we see in many Indigenous communities as well. That it's not about Band-Aid solutions, it's about really fixing the problem and earmarking a high amount of money to make that happen. So I'm not saying anything new in this chapter. Right. Many Nunavut leaders, including people like Madeleine Redfern, have spent their career arguing about this. I'm just echoing it more than anything else. But Inuit leaders up in Nunavut have already identified a lot of different ways to address this problem, and it hasn't been done yet.
And is it safe to assume that what you found for Nunavut is likely there are similar problems in other parts of the north, in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, in parts of northern Manitoba and northern Saskatchewan and northern Ontario and northern Alberta?
Absolutely. So we've already seen in Ontario that the COVID crisis has brought, has highlighted quite acutely the poverty that we see, the internet poverty and broadband poverty that we see in many rural and northern communities in Canada. So for example, the government of Ontario recently identified a pot of money to address weak broadband in northern and rural Ontario communities. So this is definitely not an isolated incident, but what's different is that Nunavut's crisis is really acute, even by Canadian standards.
Just one last question for you. while we're talking about getting the infrastructure, there's also differential availability to hook into it, given poverty and the access. I mean, we're seeing that even in Toronto with regard to during the pandemic and with regard to the kids going to school online. And that assumes people have the appropriate equipment in their own homes to hook in. So is that side of the problem being addressed? So even if there is the infrastructure, do people have access to the infrastructure on an equitable basis?
Yeah, I think that's part of what Mariana and I are hoping to highlight in this book, that it's not just about, fancy automated sidewalk covers and things like that. There are really just fundamental needs that people have to access the benefits of the internet. We don't position smart cities as this evil thing that should be avoided. It's more, who is actually being helped by the partnerships that are being introduced, the contract relationships that exist, or the policy solutions. And that's a really good question, Jim, because it doesn't just stop at broadband speed. As we see from, tower living in Toronto, there's, basic inability to access the internet that is acute in all geographies in Canada.
Well,
some of this, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mariana. Yeah, please.
Can I just sort of add a little thing here? So an issue that is only raised a little bit in the contribution by Nick DiCarlo in our book, which presents a labor point of view on smart cities, something that you never see in planning journals or in sort of smart city stuff. But something that he raises is the fact that we've given up. We never even tried to make the internet, and especially fiber optic cable, which is what you need, so you don't have to rely on these, expensive satellite, linkages in Nunavut. That we haven't thought about the internet and fiber optic cable specifically as a public utility. Mm-hmm. And so right from the beginning, because it was the telecoms that were developing this at a time when, privatization was sort of the dominant discourse, we sort of took it for granted that of course it would be Bell and Rogers and the smaller companies that would lay down the cable. Well, once you do that, there's no way you're going to get good internet in Nunavut because it's not profitable. Like, how do we have postal service in Nunavut? It's only because the post office is not a for-profit corporation, right? Because if they were a for-profit corporation, they'd shut that down in a minute. So I think something that we only touch on very briefly, but really needs to be explored, and I hope that some of the people who are watching this event will take this on, is to say, well, if the internet has become a necessary utility, just like drinking water and electricity, why shouldn't it be nationalized? Why should it not be a public service? Because if it's in the hold of the private for-profit corporations, well, we know that access is not going to be equitable. Like, it's just by definition. So, I mean, as I said in the book, we don't really go into it very much. I did find out at one point, researching the book, that the region of Peel has a publicly owned, I don't know if it's just a Wi-Fi network or if it's more than that, if it's fiber optic cable, but they developed a publicly owned network, and that allowed them to do certain kinds of things that weren't profitable and that the telecoms wouldn't have gone for. But obviously we need, something at a much bigger scale, and not just in Peel region and not just in the public libraries or wherever it is you can access this.
Are any of the other three of you aware of other places in Canada where there has been more public recognition of the need for broadband access and public control of it? So we have very few examples, I think. Brampton maybe being the only one. Blayne, I wanted you had begun talking a little bit about the Sidewalk Toronto project, which I think brings up a lot of relevant issues. As you were saying, the title of your chapter in the book is the selling of Toronto's smart city. So, I mean, given what we've just been talking about, could you tell us a little bit about how some of these issues have played out in the Toronto Quayside project, where, as if people don't know it, Sidewalk Labs was the partner that was selected by Waterfront Toronto, which itself is this so-called partnership of the federal, provincial, and city government, where Google's affiliate came in and was given this contract to really, I mean, they described it as to be a proving ground for the latest thinking in sustainable design and technology integration into urban planning. And some, great promises were made. This could create, I'm quoting, could create more than 44,000 direct jobs and 93,000 total jobs across a variety of income bands and generate 14.2 billion in annual revenue to government by 2040, helping to show the way forward for inclusive growth. Can you tell us a little bit about what was actually going on and what happened?
Sure. A lot of those numbers are an example of kind of like fake it till you make it and try to, and basically say whatever you can to get it past the finish line. I mean, I looked at the, for my sins, I spent a lot of time looking at, Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto's documents. And a lot of those projections were very, shall we say, conditional. But I think that
You're being gentle. You're being gentle.
Yes. And so I think, linking it to, especially what Alexandra and Jennifer were talking about with respect to the smart city experiences in Nunavut and in Edmonton, what you were describing, Jim, is really the approach to a smart city or to urban development that is very top down. It was effectively what happened was from the very beginning, Waterfront Toronto invites Sidewalk Labs in, not really fully understanding what the issues with respect to involving digital technologies in a city. They didn't understand data. They didn't understand intellectual property. In the original request for proposals, it just says, we'll deal with that stuff down the road. And then, of course, when people who actually know something about these issues, when they first started hearing these things, that was their first questions. What about digital? What about privacy? What about tech? What about surveillance? What about IP? What about data? None of these things were answered. But what it was, the approach they took was very much top down. We're going to bring all this stuff in here and just test it and see what works and what doesn't work. And that's a very kind of like, it's a top down vision of how development should happen, which is, part and parcel of the whole MO of Sidewalk Labs as a company, which is we want to sell all this stuff and we want to sell it all over the world. We want to develop cookie cutter technology that we could then make billions on and become the nervous system for cities around the world. Contrast that with other approaches, which start with what do we need in a city? Like what are the problems that a city or a neighborhood is, what are they facing? And then you say, oh, we have a problem with people speeding and people dying on streets. Okay, well then what do we do? And then you might bring in technology. But the Waterfront Toronto Sidewalk Labs version was let's throw these gadgets that are basically Sidewalk Labs / Google branded and make them fit into the area as opposed to tailoring policy solutions to what was in the region or what people actually needed.
Yeah, so what you're saying is they started with what the technology companies wanted to sell rather than starting with what residents identify or people in Toronto identified as needs that needed to be dealt with.
Precisely so, and with abetted by the fact that the public officials involved in this did not really understand or didn't care what they were asking for.
Well, but wasn't it pretty complex for them to do so? In other words, when I recall the Sidewalk Labs plans, they were very long documents, and you had politicians who, I mean, it's my sense. I don't know if any of you think I'm being unfair in describing it this way. They were really sort of just wowed by how all this sounded, and they wanted to seem as if they were on top of things. They didn't want to be viewed as Luddites or whatever. And so even though they didn't really understand it, they just saw it as a sparkly good thing that they better embrace for their own future, and how good it sounds to say Google is coming into Toronto and doing these things. Is that an unfair oversimplification?
I don't think so. And I think there's two things there. So first of all, there's the idea that what the materials that Sidewalk Labs produced were basically designed, they were basically all sales documents. They were released infamously a 1,500-page master innovation and development plan that every single one of those words in that title was wrong. So it did none of those things. It was basically just kind of re-promising all this cool stuff. It spent, I think, 8 pages talking about the cool smart thermostat that they would deliver, and 4 pages talking about the revolutionary new power grid that they would come up with. So it was mostly sales documents, and it was pitched at, it was designed to look like a serious report that politicians could say, well, this looks substantial, let's go with this. But at the other hand side too, politicians, they're not the only ones involved in this. There's also, you know, in my previous life, I worked on parliamentary committees, and, you know, the people, and I know that there's, like, in governments, there's people behind the scenes who are actually doing the policy work on these issues, who are working there to understand and to advise politicians. And when I saw that first town hall in November 2017, and I tuned in not knowing anything about what the project was going to be like, and wanting to say, oh, what's this cool thing that they're going to do? And, you know, knowing stuff about intellectual property, knowing stuff about data, they start talking about these things. And my first questions are, okay, what's the data governance going to be like? What's the IP governance going to be like? Andrew Clement from the University of Toronto, you know, a month after all of this, I think in early January, said, well, you know, there's a lot of issues that aren't being covered here. And Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto, both of them together, played down those issues constantly and tried extensively not to deal with those issues. So yeah, it's a part of them being wowed, politicians being wowed, but it's also on, you know, on the policymaker side, things of not knowing initially what was going on, and then trying to downplay all that stuff to get things across the finish line.
Did you see any of these kinds of things, Jen, in Edmonton, or was the experience there quite different than what Blayne has been describing about Toronto?
Well, I would say that one of the threads that we find kind of woven through a lot of smart city initiatives is the sense that cities need to innovate what they're doing. And so because of that desire to innovate or remake themselves, they can fall prey to, I think, the sales pitches that are clothed in, you know, report-like dress that are brought to them from large firms. So I think there is some of that happening in the city of Edmonton, particularly when it comes to policing. So when we look at the relationship that both IBM and TELUS seem to have with the Edmonton Police Service, and the way that they've pitched different types of projects to the police. For example, TELUS's proposal that it can create a network of security cameras that can predict crime, like graffitiing, for example, before it happens, and send out alerts to police, who would then show up just as a graffiti artist is, you know, putting the spray paint can to the wall. Those promises, I think, are just that. They're promises, maybe not even promises. I would say they're more pipe dreams. But you do have city officials who, I think, desire to show that they are trying to make the place that they're in kind of the best, most up-to-date community to live in, and especially in a place like Edmonton that likes to attract new residents and keep the people who are here. There's a lot of problems with young people leaving Alberta now, especially with decline in oil and gas related employment. I think that municipalities really desire to make themselves look to be innovative, cool places for people, especially young people, to live in. And I think that related to that desire is the sense of intercity competition, which Mariana's chapter highlights. So I think underlying the smart city language and smart city projects is this competition between cities in Canada to attract, you know, the best and brightest, whether those are folks who already live in Canada or whether they're people who are outside of Canada that they want to draw into the cities. And that goes for not just residents of cities, but perhaps even, drawing in corporate development into cities, which we see happening with Toronto's desire to have an Amazon
Right.
headquarters and so on. So I think that that competition is something else that underlies not just what's happening in Edmonton, but elsewhere in Canada. And I wonder to what extent perhaps that makes public officials perhaps even that much more beholden to corporate interests, or that much more swayed by the flashy package that comes across their desk, and perhaps less inclined to ask difficult questions about what is in the public interest, and to do perhaps a better job in consulting the many public interests that make up city living, and that should be guiding city planning decisions.
Yes. I mean, as Jen mentioned, Mariana, your chapter one is entitled "Smart Cities as a Civil Leader's Survival Game: The Lure of Innovation in a Competitive World." Could you talk a little bit more about what I guess it's the attraction, how these tech companies are able to take advantage of this desire of politicians to have their communities viewed as progressive, as attractive places for people who are there to stay or other people to come.
Yeah.
But also, if you could also comment a little bit on how much governments are prepared to deal effectively with these very powerful, brilliant, wealthy tech companies at the federal level, the provincial level, municipally. How are governments prepared to, do they have the capability, or have they developed or spent time on the capability of even being able to be on a level playing field with the companies who are there wanting to so-called partner with?
Yeah, well, in terms of your last question, certainly at the municipal level, there is no capacity. I mean, there's no way that the Google lawyers are somehow going to be outsmarted by the city solicitor, even of Toronto, never mind a small municipality. I mean, both Jen and Alex have worked for the city of Toronto and know all the lawyers there, and they could tell you it's not their fault. It's just like the Google lawyers are in a whole other universe. You might as well get your local high school basketball team to play against the Raptors. Like, it's just, it's ridiculous. So at that level, there's hardly any capacity. There would be more capacity at the provincial or federal level if those governments actually took their responsibility seriously. But instead, what they've done, especially federally, the Federal Ministry of Infrastructure ran a Smart Cities Challenge in Canada. And they had exactly three, prizes to give out. One for big cities, which Montreal won. One for medium-sized cities, which Guelph won. And then one for small municipalities and Indigenous communities. I forget who won that. But, the Federal Ministry of Infrastructure could have helped municipalities come together, share their experiences. We have a chapter in the book about the township of Innisfil, a rural township, which got into the most god-awful contract ever with Uber to provide, public transit. Well, municipalities could learn from all that, and they could come together and share stuff. But the federal government, the Ministry of Infrastructure, which is the primary agent for tech policy in this country, as far as I can figure out, set them to compete against one another. Well, like, why? And, it's true that we all need innovation, but innovation doesn't have to be competitive. Innovation could be collaborative, so I am at U of T and I'm talking to people at Ryerson about what works best for online teaching. We could collaborate instead of having the Smarter University Challenge, But this has sort of been ingrained as the format for smart city plans. So lately I've been doing research on smart cities in India, and the government of India, the Modi government elected in 2014, had as a central plank in their platform the 100 smart cities mission. And they set them to compete against one another and put in their proposals. So they're all, using the same pictures and diagrams that Blayne was analyzing, that Sidewalk Labs produced. Oh, here we can have a smart street, and we can have an app that tells you where there's a parking spot, as if that's the most pressing infrastructure need in India, you know? So this whole competitive framework is so completely, you know, terrible for cities, because what municipalities need, not just cities, small municipalities too, is to be able to learn from others, to share experiences, to pool together ideas, and to maybe put together projects that are collaborative instead of competitive. And if they start to compete, well, how can any municipality in Canada compete against Google? It's just, you know, of course they're going to lose.
I'm going to want to turn to the audience in a few minutes to bring them into the conversation, but there are two issues that have been raised briefly, and maybe one or others of you could comment on them before we turn to the audience. One has to do with the governance of the data. I mean, one of the things that all of these smart city projects have in common, because of the use of the technologies, there's a lot of data that's going to be gathered. So there's the question in all smart cities initiatives of the governance of that data, starting with who decides what data are to be collected, but then how it's to be managed and controlled. And an aspect of that, if you have a moment to also address, is part of the use of the data and part of the interest of the tech companies is in being able to mine the data for their own purposes. So I don't know if, I know there's been a lot of work done on the question of what would appropriate data governance models look like. And I didn't know if one or several of you would like to comment on that.
Well, I guess I can start. I think that one of the important things, and this is a fundamental issue with respect to governance, and it goes down to the question of who governs the smart city, or who governs the city in general. And in terms of print, there's been, like you say, there's been a lot of things suggested, like data trust, or leaving it with the companies, or what have you. But at the end of the day, the fundamental principle should be, the fundamental question is who decides how data gets used, what data gets collected. And this goes beyond just personal data, but it's basically data within a city, even if it's not identifiable, because data can be used for good purposes, it can be used for bad purposes, and depending on how you use it, certain groups will benefit and others won't. So the question of who makes that decision is the fundamental one. My own personal bias is that this decision should be made by the community, or by the government, or by the representatives of the community in which the activities are taking place. One of the big issues is with respect to, for instance, that I'd highlight with respect to surveillance, which is the other kind of like thing always lurking in the background here about, and the worry is that there'd be too much surveillance by businesses or by companies. I just highlight the work of Sarah Bannerman and Angela Rash at McMaster University, and what they find that's pertinent for this issue is that when you talk to people about their concern about data, it's not so much that their data is the surveillance, it's the purpose of the surveillance and who's doing it. So for instance, people are pretty fine with health officials collecting data and surveilling for health research purposes. And this was done before the pandemic, but I think now we kind of understand exactly where people are coming from there. But they don't want police to be able to watch their every move. So, fundamental principle of, people should have the ability to control what happens to their data or make decisions as a community, but also the idea that surveillance itself, it depends on the purpose, and that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind.
Okay. Does any of the others of you want to comment on that before we turn to the audience? Okay, Ange, do we have any questions? Could you share the first one, please?
Yeah, I just want to remind people to use the Q&A button. They can submit a question in there that I can ask the panelists for them. The first question is from Renee. Partnership, inclusion, participation, engagement, consultation are all interchangeable and easy to misuse terms. And as well in Quebec, some civic engagement is labeled as lobbying, placing the people in the same category as the companies. How do we fix what is arguably an impoverished implementation of civic engagement in Canada? even especially now as cities can use data to infer what the public wants without direct public interaction of any kind.
Who would like to?
I don't know,
Mariana,
Alex.
you looks like you're ready to start. Or
Alex, I think you should talk about this.
Sure. I mean, there's so much to say about this question, Renee. Thank you very much for asking it. I think it's a fundamental question that comes up throughout all of the chapters that we cover in this book. And we're I think really lucky that the authors who wrote for this volume each kind of considered this idea of engagement and participation on some level. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of dimensions of this question, and then I would actually love to hear what the others on this panel have to say about this as well. So one is that it's really easy in the smart city context for different governments or bodies to hide behind engagement as a rationale for why they're introducing what they're doing, and to craft an engagement strategy that gets them the answer or the focus that they would like to have. So for example, in the Sidewalk Toronto project, Sidewalk Toronto's engagement strategies were led by Sidewalk Labs. They were not led by any public body like a municipal government or a provincial government. And so therefore, when it came time to the governments in question, when they were kind of pointed to and asked, like, why aren't you doing anything about this? They could say, well, we haven't really heard anything. We haven't really confronted this issue. It's not been, no information has come to us. And so I think just, kind of building back on what Blayne said earlier about scale, like who is it that's responding or introducing the policy in question is very much tied to this question of engagement. We shouldn't really let only that body that is, especially a third party partner who's coming in, like in the case of Sidewalk Labs, run the show in determining what the smart city solution is going to be. So that's just one dimension. The second is just coming back to the question of rights. If we frame particular solutions that are being crafted as a right, it really changes the discourse on how we engage, who we have participate. If we're framing digital access, like in Nunavut, as a right, as a treaty right, as I argue that it is, and many Inuit leaders have argued that it is, it completely changes what that means in terms of who is going to be coming to the table to give commentary. So where something is optional, if it's just about a small section of Quayside in Toronto, and therefore is only going to attract a particular group of people, that's really different from saying, this is a right, and therefore we need to be thinking much more broadly about whose voices are heard in the decision making.
Well, if I can very briefly add a little postscript. Again, the Government of India's Smart City Mission says you have to have engagement. Of course, engagement here is the opposite of democracy. And I don't think it's just in India. I think in urban planning, engagement is, oh, you put something out on Facebook and see how many likes you get. I mean, I'm serious about this because one smart city proposal in India I was looking at, they had 56,000 Facebook likes. So they put that down as 56,000 people. I mean, it could have been one person liking it, 1,000 times, but 56,000 engagements. Well, engagement can just be marketing. And, Blayne certainly has documented how a lot of what Sidewalk Labs was doing was just marketing. And when you market stuff, you have focus groups and you see how people feel about it. And if there's some particular thing that maybe they don't like, but you don't give those people real choice. You might say, do you want this green or blue? But you don't say, do you want CCTV cameras or not? So democracy is what's really lacking. And the fact that so many urbanists use the word engagement really worries me, because I think engagement is the opposite of democracy.
Jen, did you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, I do. So I think that I share many of the concerns that Alex and Mariana have raised. And to add to that, I especially coming or speaking as I am in Edmonton right now, Treaty 6 territory, an additional question to ask is what obligations fall on politicians to not just hold engagement sessions or consultation sessions, or even to move through democratic processes and expect that people are going to show up to those, but what consultation obligations are on these officials to negotiate with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So for instance, what are the impacts of smart policing technologies in the city of Edmonton? Very likely they will be on, there will be negative impacts on Indigenous peoples in Edmonton in their traditional territories. What types of negotiations should be had if and when police or city governments want to introduce those types of tools? And then of course, as we've seen across Canada, the move towards highlighting racialized injustices that are very clearly experienced by Black people in Canada. What obligations should exist on governments in Canada, municipal governments and otherwise, to engage in really deep discussions with those communities who might not come to the table, whether that table is an engagement table or whether it's a democratic process table? I think that that's an additional question that needs to be at the forefront of smart city developments going forward.
Thank you.
If I could, I think.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Then we'll go back to Ange for the next question.
Sure. I think that the big lesson from Waterfront Toronto and the Sidewalk Labs Quayside project is basically, and I mean this in all seriousness, if cities want to do good and levels of government want to do good consultations, they should basically look at the Sidewalk Labs Waterfront Toronto thing and do literally the opposite of everything they did. This was and it wasn't just Sidewalk Labs, it was also Waterfront Toronto tried to claim that basically a week-long child's day camp counted as consultations. This, Sidewalk Labs released a 1,500-page report in June and gave Toronto residents basically 3 weeks to provide their evaluation for it at a time before Waterfront Toronto had even had a time to evaluate the report themselves. And so this process was not just badly run, but it was obviously badly run. And so I think there the lesson is we know what best practice consultations look like, and that we shouldn't be afraid to call them out when they're occurring, even if it's being done by a multi-billion-dollar company that should know better, or by a government agency that previous to this had a very good reputation of consultation. And I think the other lesson too, on top of what everyone else was saying, was that it's important to start with the right question. And the right question is not how can we use technology to improve people's lives? It's how do we improve people's lives? And when you start with that direction, it takes you in a much more productive direction.
Well, thank you very much. Ange, do you have a second question?
Yeah, I have a question from Nabil. Given the potential of many smart city technologies to be used as surveillance tools, how do you think activists, community groups, and civil society across Canada can collaborate and resist surveillance and monitoring?
Who would like to go first?
Well, just to put in a little plug, we have a chapter in the book about anti-surveillance design. So apparently there's all these fashion designers and artists who spent a lot of energy figuring out how, let's say if you have a t-shirt that has a lot of very visible face designs, it'll completely fool facial recognition software. So it's an interesting chapter. I mean, most of the things that are talked about in there are artistic, small-scale projects. But we have seen in the protests and the democracy protests in Hong Kong, how activists have, sort of dressed all in black and put some kind of course now everybody wears masks because of COVID anyway, but even before COVID, they were wearing bandanas or other things to conceal their face. And so if you're aware of the kind of surveillance that's going on, there's a lot of fairly low tech, cheap stuff you can do to undercut it. Now, that doesn't mean anything about larger movements. And certainly we also need to talk about the role of political parties, labor movements, and so on in, you know, going against, not so much surveillance. I think a lot of energy now is being spent on surveillance, when surveillance is sort of the last decades kind of thing. I think what's going on now more is data mining. I mean, with all the online teaching that is being done at universities, there's these private American corporations that are swallowing up not just the data that you produce as you teach or as you learn or as you hand in your assignments, but in the case of the company that U of T uses, they're actually collecting all of the websites you visited before you even turned on to your course software. So data mining is the real danger now. And a lot of the data mining uses, or a lot of data mining de-identifies the personal information. So the ultimate marketable product is an algorithm that might not have much remnant of whether it was Jen or Alex or who that produced this particular data point, but the algorithms that are being produced are produced by data mining. So one word I like is data extractivism, you know, and here in Canada, we all know about mining, and Indigenous people especially know about extractivism. So data extractivism is the economy of today. And if we get too worried about personal surveillance and who has a CCTV camera in the lobby of their apartment building, I think in some ways we're missing the boat, because that's not how big money's being made. So data extractivism is something that I don't think can be fought by individuals or even by social movements. I think it requires really strong government action. And the current bill that the federal government has introduced is really weak on that. It's all about personal data protection and says nothing about data mining.
Are you talking about the new bill C11 that was just introduced?
Yeah, I don't know what the number is, but
yeah,
must be that. Yeah,
it has a title like digital rights.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, it's a typical, I hate to say it, but it's a typical federal liberal pretense of doing something, when actually what they're doing is further empowering the Silicon Valley corporations. I mean, look, not to put too fine a point on it.
But I mean, all of the smart cities initiatives of one sort or another involve an expanded use of technologies that necessarily gather a lot of data. I think this brings us back to what you all were talking about earlier about how we govern what data are collected, how they're used, for what purposes, who has access to them, how long they're retained, and those kinds of questions. And I just don't see that we haven't gotten governments to treat that as a serious issue as yet. Are you aware of places where this discussion has actually led governments to act more appropriately to deal with these issues?
In my work, we were doing some field interviews in Brazil around, I think it was 2018, just after the Cambridge Analytica stuff happened. And we found out that Brazil was ready to go to deal with data protection issues and to get a data authority up and running. And the reason they were able to do that is because they'd been kicking around a bill in Parliament or in their Congress for about 10 years at that point. So they'd been thinking about these issues for 10 years. In the European Union, you know, they have the GDPR, and before that, they've got a couple of decades of thinking about how do we deal with data. Canada, we've been dealing with this for about, 18 months now, where people haven't been really thinking about this at all. And it still remains a problem. And it's tied to a larger problem of governance or of government capacity that goes back 30 or 40 years of kind of minimizing the ability of government to regulate and understand the world that it exists in. It doesn't have enough people, and it doesn't have enough people with knowledge of the world that we live in order to make sound regulation in this area right now. And that's a big problem that goes beyond smart cities. It goes beyond data. It's a question of capacity and how and the need to build up the government to play the role that it used to play.
Okay. Jen or Alex, did you have anything you wanted to add on this before we turn to Ange for the next question? No? Okay. Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next one is from Jim Lorimer. There seems to be various public interest organizations out there trying to get traction for a discussion in Canada of the big political issues around data collection and use, and to promote a serious alternative to the big tech corporations' agenda. For instance, the Civic Digital Network, but they seem close to invisible. Which of these groups is being effective?
Anyone have a comment on this?
I mean, some of the groups associated with Jim Balsillie out of Waterloo have done some good stuff, the Council of Canadian Innovators, but usually they have a particular angle. So like the Council of Canadian Innovators is basically telling the government that they should favor Canadian tech companies instead of Silicon Valley companies. And then there's, you know, the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which seem to have succeeded in having the government take a little bit of money from Google and Facebook and so on and give it to Canadian broadcasting and Canadian media. So I'm not aware that there's any one overall body. I mean, you know, one place that does good work is Open North in relation to smart cities, an organization based in Montreal that actually provides direct support to municipalities on the question of, if you're going to do a smart city project, how should you go about it? And they do provide that, which, as Blayne was saying, government should damn well provide. But if they don't, they do some of that. But they're somewhat limited because they're essentially funded by the Federal Ministry of Infrastructure. So they do some stuff that is good in terms of smart cities. But in terms of data policies generally, I don't know of any overall umbrella group that's really devoted to democratic data governance. And if none of you know about it, it probably doesn't exist.
There have been discussions, though, of different data governance models, data trusts, and so on. Do you see any utility in any of those approaches? Anyone?
Alex, you know, do you want to say anything about data trusts? We looked into that at the time that was something Waterfront Toronto was flogging.
Yeah, I mean, I think the similar point that we've been making all along, which is looking behind the curtain to see who's actually governing whatever system has been put in place to oversee what's happening with data and who has access to it and what it's being used for. And you know, as many of the wonderful questions that have been asked are tapping into, you know, that's really what we're trying to get at is, you know, who is holding the cards in the policy framework that's being introduced, in the way that that actors are being held accountable, and what solution to what problem is being proposed. So, I mean, that doesn't very specifically answer the question, but it comes back to the heart of it is, you know, data is a real thing, and it can be helpful and it can be harmful to particular people. And so understanding how it's being governed is really the key question.
Yeah. Well, at the time of the Waterfront Toronto thing, one of the things they did towards the end of the failed project is float this idea about how there was going to be a data trust and the Toronto Public Library was going to be in charge of it. Now, I think Alex had moved to Vancouver at that point, so we didn't go to this meeting together as we did for quite some time. But I went to this meeting and the head of the public library was there, and it was clear she had no intention of ever, you know, taking on this data trust you know, responsibility, which made sense because God knows the public library does great work, but you know, that wasn't appropriate. But somehow Waterfront Toronto had got it through its head that the way to save the whole project and make it seem like it wasn't dominated by Google was to set up a data trust. And they put out this paper called Bibliotech, TECH, to suggest that the public library should run the data trust. But really, as I said, I was there, and you should have seen the look on the face of the, you know, the chair of the public library board. She was looking like, what are you talking about? So I think there was a lot of desperate searches for some solution. But as Blayne was saying, that's no substitute for years and years and years of strong policy capacity in government, which is where this kind of responsibility lies. It lies with government. It doesn't lie with Waterfront Toronto or the public library or, you know, even the city of Toronto.
To what extent does it also lie with the residents of the municipality or the area? I mean, have you seen examples in Europe and other smart cities projects where there's been a more activist involvement by the residents of the community in the planning and design of these things?
Well, I think one of the big success stories out of the whole Quayside thing, such as it was the fact that people got engaged on those things. I mean, Toronto has a long storied history of civic engagement on various issues, you know, dating back to the 60s and probably beyond that. So I think that, you know, and people came out to these meetings, lots and lots of people. They were interested, they raised concerns, they wanted to get involved, they wanted to shape these things. So I think you've got the community engagement there. As for the success or failure of these things, I think that, you know, we don't want to place too much responsibility on the backs of individuals. This is a collective issue, and it requires basically governments to listen. And I think, like several people pointed out, the Quayside project was unique in a lot of manners because it was so isolated from democratic accountability. I have Swedish colleagues who came over here, and they said that you know, that what happened with Quayside would never ever have happened in Europe. For a couple of reasons. One of them being that you know, that cities themselves in Europe have a lot more autonomy, and also their bureaucrats that run cities and are responsible for what happens in cities have a lot more power too. And those are two things that do not really hold in Canada. But I think it really is a government issue, and I don't know. I just, you know, wouldn't want to lean too hard on people for the dystopias they might end up in.
Mm-hmm. If I could add some thoughts on this question. So
yes, please.
I'm not aware offhand of perhaps an excellent example from Canada. It's not to say they're not out there, but two examples that come to mind from the United States context is the Data for Black Lives movement, which is led by a collection of scholars and activists looking to rethink. So instead of reacting post hoc, rethinking in a prospective way how data might be used for good, especially for good in communities in the United States, predominantly Black communities, where there are serious needs that need to be met. So instead of approaching the question of data governance or the prospect of pulling back the curtain on a project that's being proposed to see what's happening behind the scenes, I think there is something that can be gained from looking to these prospective types of movements that are looking to reimagine what it means to develop communities and develop smart city type projects or data-driven projects, data repositories and so on, that really are designed to serve the goods of particular communities or to benefit particular communities. And so that would be one example, Data for Black Lives. Second example would be a really great book put out by a trans scholar and activist in the United States as well, Sasha Costanza-Chalk, on her book Design Justice, which I have right here. I would also recommend that to anyone who's interested in a different take on what designing just data-driven or tech-driven projects might look like. And there's a series of principles set out in this book, which I think could be drawn on by activist communities in Canada in thinking forward on some of the challenges and opportunities that arise in municipal governance and in urban projects across the country.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Jen. Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from David. David says, COVID has accentuated the digital divide, highlighting another feature of inequality in Canada. The Feds have announced a universal broadband fund, 1.75 billion, and Ontario government has also announced 1 billion over the next 6 years. So his question is, how do you think about or envision a progressive post-pandemic framework for internet access and use?
Go ahead, Mariana.
Well, I would go back to the question of public ownership. I know I sound like, I don't know, an NDP or circa 1965, but really, without public ownership, that $1 billion that the Ontario government promises, first of all, it probably won't materialize. They're going to say, oh, well, we had to spend all this money on nurses or whatever, so we don't really have it. They're just announcing it. But also, who are they going to give it to? They're going to give it to Rogers or somebody to lay fiber optic cable, you know, north of Thunder Bay or somewhere. Well, that's like throwing good money after bad. I happen to have a Rogers phone, so I know how they extract money from people. So why couldn't it be a publicly owned network that they're funding? If they're going to put all this money in anyway, why not make it public? Why throw money at the private telecoms? Anyway, Alex might have views on this too. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just to weigh in with a contrasting story. So Finland, for example, had declared over 10 years ago that a minimum level of broadband is a legal right, and over time they have augmented what that level needs to be as technology has changed. And so because of setting out, you know, this requirement as a right that applies for all Finnish people, the bodies that are put in place to oversee this requirement make sense, you know. So for example, there's a communications regulatory authority that's similar to CRTC, but actually has an expanded role than we see CRTC having in Canada. And like Mariana said, it's a public requirement, so it stays a public obligation that the Finnish government can be held accountable for not maintaining or not stretching out. And so under this strategy, which by the way is an Arctic country, very similar to ours with some of the same permafrost issues and, you know, environmental issues that we see here. But under this strategy, we see that broadband is available to over 99% of the Finnish population. So I think there's something really simple about just saying, this is what we're going to do. You know, we are going to have a particular level that's available to, you know, 100% of people. This is a right that we ascribe to ourselves, that we will be held accountable for, and we'll design government institutions that are responsible for carrying it out. And I think in the Canadian examples, what we see are multiple jurisdictions that each have their fingers in the pot with no clear government that is accountable for what happens.
I mean, that's certainly what we saw in the Sidewalk Labs Waterfront Toronto exercise. Instead of three governments all doing a lot around it, it wasn't clear who was doing anything. I don't know if that's an unfair characterization, but that was my sense.
Yeah, you know, it's in constitutional law. There's this maxim that's called Cooperative Federalism, which means a recognition that in a federal country like Canada, there are going to be lots of governments who are all regulating the same area. So for example, the environment, we'll see policies at the municipal level, the provincial level, the federal level. But what's problematic here is it's actually the government's running away. You know, it's not they're all trying to claim that they have jurisdiction to do it. It's they're all saying it's not us, you know, and
cooperative abdication.
Yeah, so that's what we're missing. Whose job is it? You know, and I think, you know, it sounds really simple. I don't think it's utopian. We see it play out in other jurisdictions, just saying people have an infrastructure right, just like they have a right to clean water. And if it doesn't happen, you know, a particular government is responsible.
Well, I think we'll have to end there. I want to thank the four of you for a very stimulating discussion today. And I would like to ask Brian from Ryerson's Media Services, could you put up the order form for the book, so people, if they would like to get Mariana and Alex's book, which discusses these and related issues, and is quite worthwhile to see how they can get a 20% discount if they want to order it directly from the publisher. Can you put that up, Brian? I'm not sure if that's technically possible.
Sorry, I don't have it up right now.
Is it possible to put it up or not?
Just give me a minute.
Okay. In the meantime, while that's going up, I want to thank those of you in the audience for joining us today and for your excellent questions. The next event in the Center for Free Expression's series. So there's the poster. If you look right in the center, you'll notice you can go to the lorimer.ca website and can get a copy of Smart Cities in Canada, Digital Dreams and Corporate Designs at 20% off if you order directly from the publisher and use the code SALE20. Okay, thank you for that, Brian. So our next program is going to be on Wednesday, December 9th, so 2 weeks from tomorrow, and it's entitled Cancel Culture, Censorship and Free Expression. The popular term cancel culture suggests there's a dangerous rise in censorship and public discussion that's chilling freedom of expression in universities and public libraries, in the arts and the media. This panel will be looking at, is this the case? Why, if not, why do so many people think so? Is passionate disagreement a sign of a healthy democracy or a problem to be overcome? How do we decide on the legitimate limits to free expression? So I hope if you're interested that you'll join us. The information about this panel and all our future events, as well as all our past events and podcasts of all our past events, are available on the Center for Free Expression website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. So I look forward to some of you joining us on December 9th. And again, want to thank all of you who attended this. And I want to thank our panelists again for a very stimulating discussion. Good night.
So thank you, Jim.